Grand Marshal Asen Cade stood on the observation deck of the Valkyrian Imperium's command station, staring at a tactical display that refused to make sense, no matter how many times his analysts recalculated it. A single vessel, barely 200 meters long, smaller than an Imperium supply frigate, had just disabled an entire border fleet of 11 warships without firing a single visible weapon. "Run it again," he said, his voice flat with disbelief. "We've run it 6 times, Marshal," the tactical officer whispered. "The results don't change. Every shield in the fleet failed within 4 seconds of each other. Every weapons system went dark. 11 ships, 11,000 crew, and not one Imperium soldier has fired a shot in defense because none of them can." On the screen, the small human vessel drifted silently through the wreckage of the Imperium's pride, untouched, unhurried, like a wolf walking through a flock that had simply forgotten how to run. "That is not possible," Cade said. "Humanity has no fleet capable of this. Our intelligence confirms it. Their largest warship is a fraction of our smallest cruiser, Marshal," the officer said, and for the first time in 20 years of service, Cade heard real fear in a subordinate's voice. Intelligence was wrong. None of this had begun with a battle. It had begun 6 months earlier, with a joke that nobody in the Valkyrian Imperium found funny for very long. The Imperium had ruled 11 star systems for over 3 centuries, an empire built on a simple, unshakable belief. Bigger meant stronger, and stronger meant right. Their warships were leviathans of plated hull and layered shielding, designed to overwhelm any enemy through sheer, undeniable mass. When their scouts first encountered humanity's border colonies, small, quiet, poorly defended outposts on the edge of known space, the Imperium's War Council had laughed at the intelligence reports. Humans built ships out of scavenged alloys and ran their fleets on a fraction of the budget the Imperium spent on ceremonial parades. "They are not a threat," Fleet Admiral Threxavol had told the Council, tapping her claws against the briefing table with the confidence of a woman who had never lost a war. "They are an inconvenience. We will absorb their systems within a season." Dr. Naomi Reyes had heard those words secondhand, relayed by a nervous diplomatic attaché 3 days after the Imperium delivered its ultimatum. Surrender the border colonies, or be erased from them. She hadn't laughed, she hadn't panicked either. She had simply gone back to her lab, deep beneath the surface of Kepler Station, and kept working on the project she'd spent 11 years of her life trying to finish before anyone believed she needed to. Naomi wasn't a soldier. She had never fired a weapon in her life, and the thought of war made her hands shake in a way she never let anyone see. But she understood something the Imperium didn't. Something humanity had learned the hard way. Generations ago, back when nations on Earth still fought wars with steel and gunpowder, the biggest army isn't always the one that wins. Sometimes it's the smallest idea, built quietly enough that no one thinks to guard against it. The truth stunned the entire diplomatic corps 3 days later, when Naomi walked into a War Council meeting she hadn't been invited to, and told 4 admirals that she could stop the Imperium's fleet without losing a single human life. "You're an engineer," General Marcus Webb said, not unkindly, but with the tired patience of a man who had buried too many good ideas that didn't survive contact with reality. "This is a war, Doctor, not a science fair." "I know exactly what this is," Naomi said, sliding a data drive across the table. "It's a war we can't win by matching their strength, so we're not going to try." What was on that drive would change everything, though none of the officers in that room understood it yet. Naomi had spent over a decade developing something the Imperium had never encountered, and, more importantly, had never needed to defend against. A resonance disruption field, calibrated not to destroy a ship, but to unravel the exact harmonic frequency that every Valkyrian power core used to stabilize its reactor output. It didn't blow anything up. It simply asked every system on an enemy ship, gently and invisibly, to stop working, and the ships, obedient to physics if nothing else, listened. "You want to disable their fleet with sound," Webb said slowly. "I want to disable their fleet with math," Naomi corrected. "Sound is just how it travels." But no one expected what happened next. Before the Council could even vote on deploying her technology, The Imperium's ultimatum deadline arrived 3 days early, a calculated act of intimidation meant to catch humanity unprepared. 11 Valkyrian warships entered the border system, weapons armed, ready to make an example of a species too small to matter. Naomi wasn't supposed to be aboard the response vessel. She was a scientist, not a soldier, and every regulation in the fleet said her place was in a lab, not a cockpit. But when Captain Elias Marsh, a quiet, weathered pilot, who had flown more dangerous missions than he ever talked about, learned that the disruption field required real-time calibration, that no automated system could handle fast enough, he made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. "I need someone who understands the math well enough to adjust it mid-battle," he said. "That's not a soldier, that's you." Naomi had never been more terrified in her life, and she went anyway. The ship they flew, a modest, unarmed research vessel named the Meridian, looked laughably small next to the Imperium fleet that filled the viewport like a wall of gray steel. Marcus Webb had argued against the mission until the very last hour, certain it was a suicide run disguised as strategy. Even Elias, guiding the ship forward with steady hands, had quietly written a letter to his sister the night before, just in case. "They're hailing us," Elias said as the Meridian closed within range, his voice carefully even. "Ordering immediate surrender." "Let them talk," Naomi said, her fingers already moving across the console, feeding calibration data into the resonance array hidden in the ship's modest hull. "I need 90 more seconds." Aboard the Imperium flagship, Fleet Admiral Threxavol watched the tiny human vessel approach with something between amusement and irritation. "One ship," she said to her bridge crew. "They send one unarmed ship to answer a war fleet. Either this is surrender, or it's the single greatest mistake in their species' short history." It was neither. Everything changed in the next few seconds. As the Meridian drifted into optimal range, Naomi activated the array, and across 11 Valkyrian warships, every reactor core shuddered in perfect silent unison, their harmonic stability unraveling like a chord struck impossibly out of tune. Lights failed deck by deck, shields collapsed, weapon systems, drawing power from cores that no longer understood how to hold a stable frequency, went dark one after another, faster than any crew could diagnose, let alone repair. Panic swept the Imperium fleet in a way 3 centuries of warfare had never prepared them for. There was no enemy to shoot at, no boarding party to repel, no explosion to brace against, only silence, and the slow, sickening realization that the greatest war fleet in known space had just been switched off, like a candle in the wind.
"Report!"
Threxavol demanded, gripping her command chair as emergency lighting flickered to life around her. "What did they hit us with?" "Nothing, Admiral," her tactical officer answered, voice shaking. "No projectile, no energy weapon, no radiation signature. Our own reactors just stopped listening to us." That wasn't even the biggest surprise. Naomi, watching the readouts stabilize aboard the Meridian, felt no triumph, only a wave of exhaustion so complete it nearly buckled her knees. She hadn't built a weapon of destruction. She'd built something closer to a lullaby, forceful enough to stop a war, gentle enough that not a single Valkyrian sailor aboard those 11 ships had died. Elias watched her carefully, understanding for the first time what she'd truly spent 11 years building. Not a way to win a war, but a way to end one without becoming everything she feared. The Council had made a terrible mistake, and Threxavol would spend the rest of her career learning exactly how large that mistake had been. 3 hours after the disruption field faded, and her fleet's systems flickered slowly back to life, she did something no Valkyrian admiral had done in over a century. She requested a face-to-face meeting with the human commander who had humiliated her. Without spilling a drop of Imperium blood, Naomi met her alone, aboard the drifting flagship, flanked by nothing but Elias, and a translator device she barely trusted. Threxavol towered over her, 4 times her mass, her armored plating scarred from decades of campaigns Naomi couldn't begin to imagine. "You could have destroyed us," Vol said, studying the small, unarmed woman before her with something between suspicion and reluctant respect. 11 ships, defenseless. Why did you not finish what you started?" "Because I wasn't trying to win a war," Naomi said quietly. I was trying to end one before it started properly. There's a difference, even if your people haven't needed to learn it yet. Vol was silent for a long moment, her mandibles working slowly, processing a concept that clearly didn't fit anywhere in 3 centuries of Imperium doctrine. Strength without cruelty, she said finally, almost to herself. We were told your species was weak because you built nothing large enough to fear. We never considered that you might have built something we couldn't fear at all, because it never intended to kill us. There's an old saying where I'm from, Naomi said, softer now, the adrenaline finally draining out of her voice. The strongest hand is the one that can crush you and chooses not to. My people learned that lesson the hard way, a long time ago, fighting wars against each other before we ever looked up at the stars. We buried too many people believing bigger weapons made us safer. They never did. They just made the funerals bigger too. Vol's 4 eyes narrowed, not in hostility, but in something closer to recognition. You speak as though you have grieved something you have not told me. Naomi didn't answer right away. Elias, standing quietly behind her, felt the weight of the question settle over the room like a held breath. Everyone who builds something powerful enough to end a war has grieved something, Naomi finally said. I just made sure this one wouldn't cost anyone else the same price. It was the closest she ever came, in that meeting or any other, to admitting the truth, that the resonance array wasn't born from ambition or strategy at all. It was born from a promise she'd made to herself years earlier, after watching a much smaller, much crueler conflict tear through her own home colony, back when she was young enough to believe the only way to stop a monster was to become a bigger one. She had spent 11 years proving herself wrong. Nobody knew what the human was hiding, not even Naomi herself, until that exact moment, that somewhere beneath 11 years of equations and sleepless nights, she had built the first weapon in Imperium history, capable of winning, without leaving a single grave behind. In the months that followed, the Valkyrian Imperium did not retreat from human space in shame, as some had predicted, nor did they escalate the conflict, as others feared. Instead, quietly, cautiously, Threxavol opened a diplomatic channel that had never existed before. Not out of weakness, but out of the dawning understanding that a species capable of restraint at the height of victory was far more dangerous, and far more worth listening to, than one that simply built bigger guns. Grand Marshal Asen Kadi, still staring at the tactical display, months later, finally understood what his analysts couldn't explain in numbers. Humanity hadn't beaten the Imperium with a warship at all. They had beaten it with the one thing no amount of steel could ever replicate: the discipline to hold back, when holding back mattered more than winning. Naomi Reyes returned to Kepler Station, a hero she never wanted to be, quietly requesting reassignment to a research division far from any war council. But on quiet nights, staring up at a sky full of stars that no longer felt quite so distant, she thought about Threxavol's words, and about 11 ships that had gone dark instead of dying. She hadn't built the most advanced warship the galaxy had ever seen. She had built the first one that chose mercy. And somehow, that had made it the most powerful weapon in human history. Ask if this story gave you goosebumps. Stay close, the next one is already coming, and it's going to be even more unforgettable. See you there.